this fourth session of Fruits of Conscious Aging. And today's topic will be compassion. Jerome Kerner, I'm your tech host today, along with Katie Lieberman. I'd like to introduce David. For those of you who have been here before, you're well acquainted with David and his generous gifts that he gives us this aging. But for those who are here for the first time, just briefly, David is a meditation teacher, spiritual counselor, and life coach who taught psychology and meditation at Naropa University for many years. In the early 50s, David worked with Ram Dass's Unimam Foundation in the Dying Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and became the director of the Mesilla Valley Hospice in Las Cruces, New Mexico. David later spent 3 years in Nepal doing public health development work for the Siva Foundation and studying with Tibetan Buddhist teachers. After returning to the U.S., he became the education and training director of the Spiritual Eldering Institute, now called Saging International. In that role, David taught conscious aging programs throughout the U.S., Canada, and Ireland. He is currently one of the guiding teachers of the Insight Meditation Community of Colorado and has a private practice in Boulder. So with that, I turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Jerome. I'd like to add my welcome this morning to Jerome's. What I'd like to do this morning is something that we've done in our previous gatherings. I'd like to take a few moments to gather and center ourselves with some meditation and quiet time. So if you'd like to find a physical posture that you're comfortable in and can sit basically still in for a few minutes, that would be helpful, and I think that would enhance our entire experience of being together this morning. So take a moment, and in the traditional Buddhist teachings, the phrase that's often used in this regard is the phrase, acquire a seat, as it says in the traditional scriptures. The notion being a posture in which you can feel alert and wakeful on the one hand, and relaxed and with a sense of ease at the other. And what I'll do is I'll read a short poem written by Joy Harjo, the first Native American poet laureate of the United States. And after the poem, we can sit quietly for just a few minutes and connect with ourselves and allow the busyness of the silt that so often is stirred up in our lives to settle to the bottom of the pond for a few moments. This is called Eagle Poem. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know, except in moments steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circles the blue sky in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all of this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion. Like eagle, rounding out the morning inside us. We pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. I'd like to start this morning by briefly reviewing what we've talked about so far in this particular series, in part for those of you who are joining us just for today, or perhaps for the first time, but also for all of us to have a sense of what the continuity of this process involves and how I see these different topics that we're addressing linking to one another. The basic premise of this series that I called The Fruits of Conscious Aging is that what I often call the last third of our lives, say roughly from age 60 onward, what some people call the third act, as it's discussed in the world of playwrights, represents a time, as I see it, in which we can focus more directly and more intentionally on cultivating our best human qualities. The qualities as all of the great world wisdom traditions emphasize as being desirable and beneficial in service to our own happiness and well-being, and simultaneously in service to each of us becoming an instrument of happiness and well-being in the world. Yeah. The qualities that we've talked about so far in the 3 previous meetings in the series have been integrity, generosity, and patience. Yeah. Today, as Jerome mentioned, we'll be talking about compassion. And yet, before we move on, I just want to revisit the definition that I'm using as a working definition for conscious aging in relation to this series, because I'd like there to be some sense of how I'm using that term. Yeah. This comes from something I was asked to write years ago at a staff meeting when we got into an interesting discussion that was part debate and part discussion about what we mean when we talk about conscious aging. Yeah. And so I was asked to put a statement together for the newsletter that was coming out shortly. This is what I wrote. Conscious aging is a growth-oriented way of living that emphasizes the cultivation and celebration of wisdom, love, and insight into the nature of ultimate reality. I'm not here suggesting that that's the right definition of conscious aging, because there are many. I'm simply suggesting that that's the one that I've chosen to use as the basis for this particular series of talks. Yeah. I would also share that in my own personal view, Um, the quality we'll be talking about, compassion, um, in today's world is of absolutely critical importance. There's a statement that Noam Chomsky made, one of the great intellectuals of our lifetime, a couple of years ago when he turned 93 years old. And he said, quote, "We're approaching the most dangerous point in human history." And then he went on to say that we are, quote, "facing the prospect of the destruction of human life on Earth." So while I don't want to be an alarmist or a doomsday prophet in any way, shape, or form, I do think that as elders and elders in training, it serves us to be realistic about the state of what's happening on our planet right now, and to recognize that each in our own way, I believe, is called to bring our compassion to the world in a way that can help perhaps turn the Titanic in a different direction. Yeah. I don't feel in the least bit naive about the challenges we're facing. I do find, however, that in my own life, it serves me to see what's happening on our beautiful blue-green planet right now as a challenge that I want to meet, rather than a source of despair that leads me to want to hide under the covers when I wake up in the morning. Um, so, with that larger context in mind, I would also say that the way that we cultivate compassion on the big picture level necessarily begins with ourselves. And in particular, given the focus of this organization and this particular webinar series, I'd like to take a look at to what extent we're able to relate to our own experience of becoming older human beings with the kind of compassion that's needed in the larger world right now. Uh, Certainly, we've all heard the cliche, I suspect, that, quote, "aging is not for sissies," unquote. Yeah. Um, like a lot of cliches, there's a lot of truth in that statement. It's not easy to become an older human being, particularly in a culture like ours that glorifies youth and tends to denigrate and degrade the value and meaning of being an older person. Yeah. Um, so I'd like to do a little experiment with you just to take a look at this, almost like a kind of a yardstick or a baseline measure of a sort. Um, and I'll describe this to you, and then perhaps we can try it together. Yeah. This is an exercise that's kind of unusual. I experienced it in a workshop many years ago and found it to be very rich. And some of you might recognize it because I talked about it in my book, Life Part 2. Yeah. It's an exercise called power whining. Yeah. Power whining. And it's related to the fact that we live in a culture, as I think we all know, where we're not supposed to complain. Most of us frown upon people who we see as complainers. We try to avoid that in our own lives for the most part. And we assume that it's unproductive, generally speaking. Yeah. Um, for this particular process, I would like to suspend that prohibition. And as much as you're able, put aside any viewpoints you have about complaining being problematic or something that you shouldn't do or that you don't like about yourself or people won't like about you. Um, and I'd like you to take a few moments. I'll ring the bell so we can sit quietly for a little bit to do this. And I'd like you to reflect upon the aspects of growing older that you don't like, the parts of becoming an older person that you find difficult or that you find irritating or that you find painful and that you find hard. Yeah. My educated guess here is that you'll be able to come up with something. Yeah. All right. So just to begin with, um, and I want you to put if you have any tendency, like a lot of us do, to be self-critical or perfectionistic, or that voice that I mentioned that says you shouldn't complain, um, just give yourself permission to put that in the background. And in fact, give yourself permission to lean into complaining. Like really do it with gusto if you can. If you have a piece of paper there, you can jot a list of some of the things you dislike about aging, right? And we'll just do this for about 2 minutes or so. Um, if you really or don't want to do it, as I've said on other occasions, it won't affect your grade negatively. And you can just listen to what other people share about it, huh? So I'm going to ring the bell, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to jot a list or bring to mind the aspects of aging that you find difficult and dislike. Okay? On your mark, get set, go. Okay, let's bring that to a close. And now what I'd like to ask you to do, those of you who are open to it, is to put some comments in the chat about what came up on your list. Just type them into the chat. Um, you don't have to list every one if it's a long list, but let's get a sense of what's here. And I'm going to read these out to the group like a collage so that we can get a picture of our collective situation. Yeah. Um, Losing friends, weight gain, eye floaters, not remembering, friends falling apart, feel like a tech dummy and don't want to have to learn so much, vanity, ego, wrinkly, sagging skin, vanity, getting ugly, sore joints, not recovering from kinks and injuries, feeling invisible in society and less relevant. Let's see what else we've got here. Invisible to others, less physical strength, um, getting wet macular degeneration and losing some of my sight, uh, wrinkles, leg veins, less energy, can't garden, belly, inability to kick the soccer ball and play volleyball with grandchildren, being invisible again, that shows up numerous times here, changing body parts, becoming eventually a burden, harder to find connection when moving after 60, needing to wear glasses to read, joints that stiffen, feeling othered by family, not respected, aches and pains. I don't have the interest, enthusiasm, and energy to do things outdoors like hiking, not bouncing back from an illness. My feet hurt every morning. Can't move, think, and produce as I used to. Immune system declining. Takes more time and energy to do things. Having a hard time recovering some words. Brain power diminishing. Less mobile. The cost of medicine. Hindsight is 2020 and somewhat annoying. It was so confusing at the time. Frequent visits to doctors, dentists, and optometrists, watching my body fall apart and losing skills. Uh, Boy, I'm afraid I'm going to have to dispense antidepressants here shortly, so bear with me. Um, Physical decline, not traveling, no more mountain hiking, forgetting names, not as sharp, can't drive on the highway anymore. So much time needed for self-care and just trying to hold on to what I have physically. loss of younger good looks and agile body, living with chronic ailments. Okay, great. So take a moment, if you would, and without judgment, just check in with yourself and notice what you're feeling at this moment, having heard these things and acknowledged these realities that are true in all of our lives as we age. Just notice what goes on in your heart and in your body and in your mind, and do that with loving curiosity rather than any inclination toward self-criticism. And once again, if you would, jot a few words in the chat. What kind of feelings, what kind of emotional states? How did your heart feel? Let's take a look at some of these qualities. Makes me very sad. Uh, feel validated and like I'm not alone. Depressed and hopeless. Sad, but sense of belonging, not alone with this. Heavy heart. Sad. Evidence that I'm not the only one feeling these things. It's tough. Sad, lonely, also in a way more connecting, hearing how many others feel the same, which normalizes these feelings. I'm probably not as bad off as others. I'm not alone. Simultaneously amused and concerned. Curious about what is coming next, without fear. I remember Father Thomas Keating, one of my mentors, saying that to me about death when he was 94, and we were sitting and talking about his approaching death. Healing to share the experience. Okay. So tell me what happens as we sit here together right now. One more comment, not alone, wondering how the younger ones see us, yet it is still a good time in life. What happens inside of you if you recognize the possibility of choosing to see these experiences that you just described as a curriculum for spiritual awakening? Rather than looking at them through the lens of being a problem without denying that they're difficult, what happens if you see that these experiences that are a part of our lives as we age have the possibility of becoming stepping stones in the direction of our awakening to our deeper spiritual nature? What we want to recognize here is that we have a very limited amount of influence over choosing these experiences or not. A lot of these experiences are beyond our control, quite clearly, and they're existentially built into our common situation, right? Um, we've all lived long enough to know that there's a lot that goes on in our lives that we don't have control over, or we have minimal control over in many cases. What we have a lot of influence over is how we respond to the events in our lives. What it means to age consciously or to become a wise elder in the way that we've talked about it since Reb Zalman began his work many years ago, is that we can develop wise and skillful and compassionate ways to respond to what goes on in our lives. And in particular, these changes, as you noticed, can become a gateway to compassion for others. There were numerous comments in what people wrote that you just heard, in which people said, I feel less alone. I feel more connected. Yeah? Because In the last third of our lives, every human being experiences some version of what we're talking about here. No one is exempt, regardless of how spiritually evolved they are, or how wealthy they are, or how important they are in the eyes of the world. Yeah. Um, so, one of the key qualities that we want to cultivate in dealing with these exact experiences is this quality of self-compassion. That's part of the curriculum that we're all being provided if we're willing to make use of it. Yeah. There's been a tremendous amount of work, as some of you know, in the last 20 to 25 years in relation to self-compassion. People like Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, who have an institute based in San Diego, an institute that teaches self-compassion, teach a whole variety of spiritual practices and methods that help us to cultivate a more compassionate way of being with ourselves, which is particularly important in a culture like ours, where we have superegos that have extremely high and unrealistic expectations of ourselves in many, many cases. Yeah. Very simple reflections and teachings that this self-compassion training involves can really help us. Yeah. For example, there's a simple reflection taught in the self-compassion training that says, life is difficult. Yeah. Let me see if I can pull this one up. Um, Essentially, what it says is that everyone experiences life is difficult. This is true for everyone. May I be kind with myself in dealing with this. May I give myself the compassion I need. Yeah. So the idea here is that everyone experiences these issues. They're not signs of inadequacy, as the culture would have us believe. And that because everyone experiences them, they can connect us in just this way. And what we need to cultivate in responding is kindness and compassion toward ourselves. Yeah. So let's try one more little experiment that I want you to do a little bit of writing with. So if you don't have a pen or a piece of paper, take a moment, if you would, and get one. This is also going to be a short experiment, 3 or 4 minutes. Sometimes this is called first thought, best thought. So that rather than being deeply analytical with the left side of your brain, just take what comes stream of consciousness. I'd like you to put 2 prompts on your page. The first one is, in relation to these difficulties that we just talked about, I want you to consider ways in which, write this down, ways in which I have been uncompassionate toward myself when dealing with these difficulties. Ways in which I have been uncompassionate toward myself in dealing with these difficulties. And you do that for a couple of minutes. And then I want you to turn it around. Ways in which I have been compassionate toward myself in dealing with these age-related difficulties. So I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes. I'll tell you when we're about halfway through, so you know when to switch to the second prompt if you haven't done that. And let's begin that now, right? Consider what you wrote about the difficulties, ways in which you've been uncompassionate first, then reflect on ways in which you've been compassionate. So that's about the halfway point. If you haven't already, switch to the second prompt, ways in which I've been compassionate toward myself in relation to these age-related changes. Okay, let's bring that one to a close, please. Let's go back to the chat one more time. Yeah, this time if you could jot a brief note in there, first in relation to the first prompt. And let me caution you here to not be uncompassionate with yourself about the things you've been uncompassionate with yourself about. Yeah? Just put a note in the chat about the ways that you've seen yourself be uncompassionate. Let's see, as one therapist of mine used to say to me, how we do ourselves, right? Sad, giving up, not caring. Okay. Judgment. Let's see. Whoops, boy, they're coming in fast and furious. uh, Whoops, let's see. Judgment, critical, envious, blaming myself for not taking better care of myself when I was younger. I'll bet some of us can relate to that. Too high expectations. Avoid having photos taken of me and feel self-loathing when I see a picture of me. Feeling shame about infirmities. Ignore the problem. Shame, frustration, comparing to others. Self-judgment. Lack of forgiveness about weight gain. Comparing to others who seem to be handling aging better. Resistance. Not as much energy. Denying the permanence of some changes. Isolating myself. Always notice my mistakes and shortcomings. Critical of myself and expect to be rejected. Ignore dietary taboos for joint care. Pushing myself too hard. Ignore taking naps when I feel the need. Okay, good. Let's flip it over. What are some of the ways in which you've been compassionate towards the age-related changes in your life? Gratitude. Powerful. Gratitude. What else comes up? Laughing a lot. Humor. Soothing self-talk. Wonderful. Now that I'm not teaching, taking classes instead of teaching. I can relate to that one. Savoring moments. What one neuropsychologist calls savoring the good. Allowing and loving slow morning starts. Asking for help. There's an interesting one. Modify and pivot. So flexibility comes into play. Being quieter. Acceptance, adaptation, finding new ways to be and do. There's humor again. Acceptance, happy tears, sense of snuff. Give myself permission to rest. Getting help. Realize I'm no different than others, that we're all experiencing the same things. Lowering my goals for my lapse. Celebrating how much I accomplish instead of being angry for not being able to do as much. Giving myself pep talks. Put my hand on my heart and say, sweetheart, this is hard. It's good self-talk. Accepting things as they are now, that I don't have to do anything at this stage in my life. Taking up yoga, being kind about sleep changes, meditation, focus on just being, enjoying slowing down, choosing peace, connecting with others, using a walking stick regularly, learning and using spiritual tools, and aware of the need for hydration. Okay, wonderful, right? So you can begin to see how there's a way in which some of our wisdom is drawn out by the challenges that we're presented with. In one of the earliest of the Spiritual Eldering Institute workshops, before Saging International had come into being with that name, there was a nun who came to one of the workshops named Sister Anne. And when we discussed some of this material about the difficulties associated with aging, this was her comment, which some of you might be able to relate to based on what you've just written. She wrote, the diminishments of old age school us in the art of humility and self-acceptance. Because we can't rely on our former attainments and our physical strength, we must search more deeply within ourselves for a fund of inner strength and wisdom. Increased reflection and contemplation in elderhood, as taught by the world's mystical traditions, are invaluable in helping us to befriend our hidden depths. So what are we saying here, right? You can begin to see what I mean by looking at the changes inherent in the aging process as a curriculum. One of the aspects of Buddhist psychology that's always appealed to me is that there's an emphasis on the notion that whatever qualities we want to cultivate and see in the world, we necessarily have to begin by cultivating within ourselves. The more we do that kind of inner contemplation and develop compassion for ourselves, the more genuinely and authentically we can extend that compassion into the world. Yeah. Consider this comment from Ram Dass's book, How Can I Help? I have a friend, a chemotherapy nurse in a children's cancer ward, whose job it is to pry for any available vein in an often emaciated arm, to give infusions of chemicals that sometimes last as long as 12 hours, and which are often quite discomforting for the child. He is probably the greatest pain giver the children meet in their stay in the hospital. Because he has worked so much with his own pain, his heart is very open. He works with his responsibilities in the hospital as a laying on of hands with love and acceptance. There is little in him that causes him to withdraw, that reinforces the painfulness of the experience for the children. He is a warm, open space which encourages them to trust whatever they feel. And it is he whom the children most often ask for at the time they are dying. Although he is the main pain giver, he is also the main love giver. So what we're seeing here, that I think we've all come to realize with greater or less recognition, is that from a spiritual standpoint, the suffering in our lives is functional. It functions to sensitize and open our hearts to the suffering of other human and non-human beings and the suffering of the planet herself. So that as we deepen our openness to our own difficulty and suffering, we open our hearts more deeply to the suffering in the world around us, and we naturally begin to feel moved to express that compassion in the world in some kind of action. Yeah. Years ago, there was a wonderful Tibetan Buddhist teacher named Kalu Rinpoche, who had been a cave dweller, classic Tibetan cave dweller, for something like 12 or 13 years before some of the other Tibetan lamas came to him and essentially begged him to come out because the world needed his wisdom and compassion. Yeah. And so he did come out and he began to teach and developed a strong following in the West as well as in Asia. Yeah. I had the good fortune to meet him at one point when I was working at Ram Dass's dying center in Santa Fe, and he came to bless someone who was dying there. Yeah. When Kalu Rinpoche was first visiting the United States, I think it was 1972, some of his senior students wanted to show him the sights in Boston where he had landed. So they took him around the town a bit, and they took him to the Boston Aquarium, right? When they went in, Kalu Rinpoche had never seen anything like an aquarium. Um, and he was fascinated with all the diverse forms of marine life there. And he went up to the first tank that they came up to, and he knocked on the tank like you would knock on somebody's window when you wanted to get their attention, you know. And then when a fish came swimming close to where he was knocking, he did this Tibetan chant where he said, Om mane padme hum, Om mane padme hum, Om mane padme hum, you know. And then he knocked on the tank a bit longer till another fish came. And he did that with a whole bunch of the fish in the aquarium. So you can imagine how long it took for this visit to the aquarium, right? When they were leaving, one of the senior students asked him what he was doing, right? And he said he was blessing them so that they would have an auspicious rebirth, basically, where they wouldn't be trapped in a tank, essentially. Yeah, right. But you can imagine the kindness underneath that kind of behavior, right? That evening, they had set up a speaking engagement for him with a group they thought was a spiritually oriented group like their own, but it turned out to be a spiritualist group that did seances and all kinds of uh, telekinesis and psychokinesis, and people really interested in very, very kind of edgy, far out psychic phenomena. So Kalu Rinpoche gave a short Dharma talk, as they call it, for Buddhist teachers about the spiritual nature of reality, and then took questions. And the questions came in were questions like, are you clairvoyant? Can you tell me about the future? And and the translator had to translate all this to Kalu, and he said no. And they said, um, do you practice psychokinesis? And one man held up his watch and he said, can you stop the hand on my watch from where you're sitting? Right? And they explained to Kalu, and he said, no. And there were numerous questions like that. And finally, one person in a somewhat frustrated voice said, well, what can you do? Right? And the translator translated that to Kalu, and he smiled and he said, quote, I simply practice compassion for all living beings. Right? That was his superpower, if you will. Right? And that's the vision in Buddhism and many contemplative traditions of what the spiritual life is ultimately about in that sense, right? We practice compassion for ourselves in regard to our own challenges and difficulties, whether they're age-related or not. That opens our hearts to ourselves initially, and then we come to know the common ground. We come to understand the relationship between what Stephen Levine called my pain and the pain. And we recognize that it's an existential truth, suffering and pain, that connect us all when we have the eyes to see the point of connection. Yeah. Um, there's a particular image I have on the wall in my office where you can kind of see over the meditation table. There's another tanka like the one behind me, and it's a tanka of a Tibetan bodhisattva called Avalokiteshvara, who's said to be the bodhisattva of compassion. And this is what's called a four-armed Avalokiteshvara. Yeah. Um, uh, I have an image of it that I'm going to put on the share screen, and I just want to talk briefly about the symbolism of it, because it represents the way compassion plays a central role in a spiritually conscious life. So if you notice, in this case, Avalokiteshvara is a Buddha-like figure who has four arms. If you look at the two in the center over Avalokiteshvara's heart, you can see that uh, Avalokiteshvara is holding what's called the wish-fulfilling gem, right? Compassion is said to be the wish-fulfilling gem that when dropped into our minds, just like a tablet can purify a glass of water when it's dropped in, when you drop the wish-fulfilling gem into the consciousness of a spiritual practitioner, all of the impurities dissolve, according to the teachings. And what comes forth is our basic goodness, what the Dalai Lama calls our good heart. Yeah. Um, and then if you notice the two upper arms, the one on the right side is holding a crystal mala, like a rosary, and the one on the left hand is holding a pristine lotus flower. Yeah. These represent the fact that when you use the mala beads or the rosary beads, you continuously tell the beads so that Avalokiteshvara is continually a force of compassion in the world on an ongoing and continuous basis, and bringing the beauty of our humanity as represented by the lotus flower into manifestation in the world. Yeah. Thank you, Jerome. You can take that down for the moment. Um, that particular image is one that I first encountered in the 80s when I was training in Nepal with Tibetan teachers. And I used to spend a lot of time simply gazing at that particular tanka, which is part of how some of the visualization practices are done in Tibetan Buddhist training. Yeah. There was one particular visionary experience I had when I was meditating in front of that tanka, and I went into an altered state of a particular kind and dropped into what felt like a very deep state of consciousness. It felt a bit like going down an elevator or going to the bottom of the ocean in a diving bell. I got very, very still. The thinking process dissolved temporarily. So there was just a kind of presence. And I heard a voice that seemed to be an instruction to practice for the rest of my life. And what it said is, quote, "The crystal mala is the key. That's all you ever need to know. The crystal mala is the key. That's all you ever need to know." And I understood in that moment that it was referring to the crystal mala in the hand of Avalokiteshvara. And then I saw from that moment on that my spiritual path and my life journey was about cultivating compassion in my own relationship to myself and aspiring to be an instrument of compassion in the way I moved through the world. Not with the kind of perfectionism that we often burden ourselves with, but with a sense of aspiration, like a vision for what's possible for us as human beings. Yeah. This is why I see compassion to be one of the very important fruits of conscious aging. Given the state of the world that we're living in, it's hard to imagine another quality that the world more desperately needs than the quality of compassion. Um, so what do we actually mean by compassion? Let's talk about that for a moment. Yeah. It's talked about in different ways. If we look at the Latin root of the word, compassion means literally to suffer with. If we look at the Latin roots, that is, when we're in the presence of suffering of another, instead of turning away and using our psychological defenses to close down and disengage, as we often do when we walk by homeless people on the street or driving by on a street corner. Rather, we let our hearts break open. We recognize the suffering around us, and we have that recognition be an inspiration to open our hearts in such a way that, as we conventionally say in language, we feel moved to do something about it. Yeah. One of my Buddhist teachers described compassion as, quote, the quivering of the open heart in the presence of suffering. She said it was like what happens when two stringed instruments are in the presence of one another and they harmonize in a particular way and come into resonance. Yeah. That's what happens to our hearts when we've trained our hearts to open rather than contract in the presence of suffering. Yeah. We know compassion when we see it quite clearly, even though sometimes there's what's called the near enemy of compassion shows up looking like compassion. The near enemy of compassion is pity, actually. Rather than seeing myself in someone else or another living being who's suffering and recognizing that we're equal and we share the same possibilities, there's a subtle way and sometimes that we look down our noses a little bit at someone who's suffering, like, you poor person. Yeah. That's the near enemy, as it's sometimes called. It's a diluted version of genuine compassion. But consider this story, and let's see if we can get a felt sense of what genuine compassion looks like. This is written by a surgeon, a gifted medical doctor, who's also quite wonderful as a writer, named Dr. Richard Selzer. I stand by the bed where a young woman lies, her face post-operative, her mouth twisted in palsy, clownish. A tiny twig of the facial nerve, the one to the muscles of her mouth, has been severed. She will be thus from now on. As surgeon, I had followed with religious fervor the curve of her flesh. I promise you that. Nevertheless, to remove the tumor in her cheek, I had to cut the little nerve. Her young husband is in the room. He stands on the opposite side of the bed, and together they seem to dwell in the evening lamplight, isolated from me, private. Who are they, I ask myself, he and this wry mouth, who gaze and touch each other so generously? The woman speaks. Will my mouth always be like this? She asks. Yes, I say, it is because the nerve was cut. She nods and is silent. But the young man smiles. I like it, he says. It's kind of cute. All at once, I know who he is. I understand and I lower my gaze. One is not bold in an encounter with a god. Unmindful of my presence, he bends to kiss her crooked mouth. And I'm standing so close, I can see how he twists his own lips to accommodate hers, to show her that their kiss still works. I remember then that the gods appeared in ancient Greece as mortals, and I hold my breath and I let the wonder in. Yeah. So many feelings that story touched in me the first time I came across it. Yeah. Pema Chodron, in one of her books, a well-known teacher and elder in the meditation world, familiar to some of you, perhaps many of you, described an experience of this kind where she received a letter from a young woman who was traveling in the Middle East and had an experience of the kind of compassion we're talking about here today. This is Pema from her book, The Places That Scare You. A young woman wrote to me about finding herself in a small town in the Middle East, surrounded by people jeering, yelling, and threatening to throw stones at her and her friends because they were Americans. Of course, she was terrified, and what happened to her is interesting. Suddenly, she identified with every person throughout history who had ever been scorned and hated. She understood what it was like to be despised for any reason: ethnic group, racial background, sexual preference, gender. Something cracked wide open, and she stood in the shoes of millions of oppressed people and saw with a new perspective. She even understood her shared humanity with those who hated her. This sense of deep connection, of belonging to the same family, is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a Buddhist term that's translated variously as the good heart, or altruistic intention, or the compassionate heart. Yeah. This is the place in which each of us can experience our humanness and the challenges of our humanness and see the way it can become a vehicle for self-transcendence. Because by embracing our difficulties with compassion, rather than pushing away our humanness, we actually come to know the place in us and actualize the place in us that allows us to also know our deeper spiritual nature, whether we call that our soul, or our Buddha nature, or our true nature, or our Christ consciousness, which are all different names for the other part of us that is also integral to our humanness. So what the wisdom teachings have been saying for centuries, as I've talked about in other webinars, is that we human beings live on two levels of consciousness at the same time. On the finite level of our humanity, we are biological organisms who are born and who live and who physically die. According to the great wisdom traditions, there's another larger transpersonal dimension to who we are, given the kinds of names I mentioned a moment ago. And what we come to see here is that the difficulties in our lives and the curriculum I've been referring to enables us to come to know this deeper dimension of who we are, which is described in a variety of ways. The Buddha described it as the deathless. It was also described in Buddhist and other Eastern teachings as the unconditioned. Yeah? This is the divinity that we talk about in the theistic religious traditions. When we talk about comments by Jesus like, the kingdom of heaven is within you, right? In different traditions, different languages used. But what all of us, I think, are yearning for is to know this deeper dimension of our nature, which is said to live beyond time and space entirely. We don't have to take anyone's word for this, and we shouldn't actually, because that's naive. However, we can trust that what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, which was his term for the core concepts and the core values shared by all the wisdom traditions, actually represent truths that we can come to know directly and personally in our own lives. Yeah. Many of us get glimpses of these kinds of moments in our lives when we have experiences of dissolving our identification with our small self and feeling one with the sunset that we're watching. Or in moments of lovemaking, when the sense of separation disappears and there's just presence and consciousness and loving kindness. Right? These are experiences we all have access to, and compassion is the vehicle that supports their realization in our lives. Right? Ram Dass talked about this years ago when he wrote sort of his version of the Bible for young people in the 60s, Be Here Now. And he described the process of our experience as spiritually oriented seekers and finders, right? This is how he described what we're doing when we're involved with conscious aging. Quote, "What is happening to you is nothing less than death and rebirth. What is dying is the entire way in which you understood who you are and how it all is. What is being reborn is the child of the Spirit, for whom all things are new." That's that second level I'm talking about. This process of attending an ego that is dying at the same time as you are going through a birth process is awesome. Be gentle and honor that the small self, the individual human self that is dying, as well as that our true nature, which is being born. When Ram Dass first wrote that, he was in his 40s. Many years later, in his 80s, he wrote a sequel called Still Here, right? The subtitle of which is Embracing Aging, Changing, and Dying. Yeah. At the very end of that book, he wrote something similar to what he had written all those years before. That's very directly related to our interest in conscious aging. This is how he ended his book. This book is more of my, quote, advanced scout role. These days, I'm the advanced scout for the experiences of aging. And I've come back from the scouting party to bring good news. The good news is that the spirit is more powerful than the vicissitudes of aging. My stroke was a good test for my faith. The bar was high. I came away from the stroke firm in my faith. And I now know that my faith is unshakable. That assurance is the highest gift I have received from the stroke. And I can say to you now, with an assurance I could not have felt before, that faith and love are stronger than any changes, stronger than aging, and I am very sure stronger than death. So what is it I'm trying to say here this morning, right? Well, I'm suggesting that one of the important fruits of conscious aging is the quality of compassion, and that we begin by cultivating it in our relationship to ourselves, and that when we do that, there's a natural and organic movement toward expressing it in the world. And that because we've cultivated it in ourselves, our expression of it in the world will be authentic and genuine and beneficial to those we come into contact with. Yeah. For those of us who aspire to move through the world as wise elders and elders in training, this kind of cultivation of compassion, from my perspective, is critically important. I've also suggested that given the state of our world right now, that importance is amplified many times over. And the beauty of this to me is that this is something that's possible for all of us. As long as we can begin by putting aside our perfectionism and our unrealistically high expectations, giving ourselves full permission to embrace our humanity with all of its quirks and foibles and vulnerabilities and uncertainties, and beginning to love ourselves as we are in our humanness as a way of actualizing our deeper spiritual nature, our true nature, which can enable us to see the world through the kind of eyes that Ram Dass described in that quote. Yeah. I suspect we see these qualities in many of the teachers whose books we read and whose lives we admire. And we can begin to take ownership of those qualities in ourselves as well, as we continue to do our inner development and our service in the world. Yeah. We have to have the courage to turn toward what's happening in our lives in the world, rather than buy into all the cultural messaging and diversion that encourages us to turn away from the challenges in our lives. Yeah. So I'll close with a comment made by Pema Chodron, who understood this process and to this day in her late 80s continues to teach and share the nature of this process as she understands it with others. For those of us looking for someone who models a way to age consciously, I would say that I see Pema as one of the most inspiring models on our planet right now that I've come across. This is what she wrote. Spiritual awakening is frequently described as a journey to the top of a mountain. We leave our attachments and our worldliness behind and slowly make our way to the top. At the peak, we have transcended all pain. The only problem with this metaphor is that we leave all the others behind. Our drunken brother, our schizophrenic sister, our tormented animals and friends. Their suffering continues, unrelieved by our personal escape. In the process of discovering our true nature, the journey goes down, not up. It's as if the mountain pointed toward the center of the earth instead of reaching into the sky. Instead of transcending the suffering of all creatures, we lean toward the turbulence and the doubt. We jump into it. We slide into it. We tiptoe into it. We move toward it however we can. We explore the reality and unpredictability of insecurity and pain, and we try not to push it away. If it takes years, if it takes lifetimes, we will let it be as it is. At our own pace, without speed or aggression, we move down and down and down. With us move millions of others, our companions in awakening from fear. At the bottom, we discover water, the healing water of compassion. Right down there in the thick of things, we discover the love that will not die. What I'd like to do is stop here. I wanted to allow some time for some conversation or discussion. If you have comments or reflections on my comments or questions you'd like to bring up, complaints you'd like to bring up, I can be your customer service representative, just like at Target, you know, about aging. But I would and see if there's any back and forth you'd like to have, and see where these reflections of mine have taken you. Yeah. So let me just open that up. If you have a comment you'd like to make, you can click the react button at the bottom of your screen. That'll notify us that you'd like to comment, and one of us will invite you to raise a hand. Or if you want to put a comment in the chat, um, if Katie, if you or Jerome could monitor the chat and let me know when things show up there, we can also share the chat material. Susan, would you go ahead and unmute, please?
Sure. Thank you for all this. I'm finding myself with these dual feelings like, what? Just compassion? That on the one hand, it seems so just too simple. Like, isn't there something more complex to help me get over all this anxiety around aging? And yet it cuts so much to the core, whether it's about aging, living, and all. So I will let that digest and really appreciate that, both the simplicity and truth, and love that Pema Chodron passage. By the way, is that from, well, what book is
That's
that?
from When Things Fall Apart.
Yeah.
One of her most popular books, given that, especially for people in our age group, since our bodies are tending to do that from day to day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let's just check and see if there's any other reflections or questions or comments that come up. Go ahead, Laura, if you want to unmute, please.
Wow, David, this has been incredible. And much of the time, as you move towards the end, I had happy tears, what I call happy tears, which is the suffering sadness moving to joy. But what came up for me was I had polio when I was 2.5, and I was in the hospital for 6 months. And your talking took me back there. I don't have memories, but the compassion that I got from nurses and social workers. They said I was like the mayor. I would sit in the middle of the ward and call the nurses but what it made me think, and I started writing, was that I still would move into this perfectionist place, but that compassion I got gave me faith that I could survive, because I am ambulatory and I was very lucky in many ways. But I've fallen physically a lot in my life, but my spirit doesn't give out. And I think, and I always try to do too much, but I think that compassion from when I was in the hospital really gave me faith. And there's something about it, the way everything you did today, that was very moving. And thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for your comment and sharing about that. Boy, I resonate, Laura, with your comment, because my wife had polio when she was 18 months old.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And when I met her, I would have never known it. She was a trek leader for wilderness travel in Nepal and sleeping on glaciers at 17,000 feet. So it was only after we got to know each other that she told me about having a brace on her leg when she was a little girl and being unable to play with other kids. And not by accident, she became a physical therapist working with disabled children.
Yes. Let me tell you, when I had my first post-polio evaluation, they titled what she had and what I had, we were passers. People, as we got older, didn't know. So the secret wasn't always so good, because inside we felt it.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. Any other comments or reflections, thoughts, questions, or reflections? Well, maybe we've done it, huh? I think the homework is pretty clear uh, from today's conversation. Um, uh, Peggy, I see you've got a hand up. Go ahead and unmute if you would.
Yeah, I just want to comment on my silence. Is my silence is, when you say homework, my silence is because there was so much and so much to take in and, you know, to explore for myself to go forward. And I just wanted to make that known to you and to the others. Yeah.
I mean, that's the beauty of all of you having a video as part of this program and being able to revisit the material should you choose to do that. Because um, it's a powerful topic that plays maybe it's apparent, it plays an absolutely central role in my life. And I think that's where some of the energy that you're seeing and experiencing comes from. When I look at my personal and professional life, it's the energy of compassion that has fueled the whole process. Once I was able to work through some of my own pain as a young person and understand what role it was playing in my life, I felt so inspired to try to bring as much of that kind of energy to the world as I possibly could. And it's what gets me out of bed in the morning, actually. So, yeah, I think it's a fine time to close.
It is.
It's always it's a delight to get together with people like yourselves who share my interest in the kinds of topics we're exploring in this series. And I hope you have a really good month. And I'll look forward to us being together again next time we gather. So thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank you, David.
I think Peggy spoke for all of us. The richness and depth of what you gave is difficult to take in, and I think we need to sit with it. And we thank you for the gifts you give us. And I also want to thank Rosemary Cox, who's with us, who's our education coordinator, who's made all this happen. And Rosemary, do you want to say a word about what's coming up in October?
Okay. Yes, in October, David will be back. David, what is the topic in October? I don't have that in front of my head here.
I don't either.
Oh, well, it will be good. Come back.
It's
Most of you
October
are
6th.
signed up for the series. Yeah.
October 16th. Yeah.
Okay. And then on October the 15th, if you're really curious about Saging International, we are having a wonderful celebration. It's called the Celebration of Reb Zalman, our founder, Saging International, how we've grown and evolved, and it's a celebration of you. And this program, there will be a ritual, there will be guest speakers galore, some who knew Reb Zalman very well, and it's free. There's no charge for this. So I really invite you to look for that and to sign up for it. Right now we have over 150 people registered. But please think about coming. You'll find out more about, if you're joining us with our programming, you'll find out more about who we are and what saging is. So I guess that's my message for today. And I want to thank David for he's our resident speaker, I guess. And David said he would do this for 10 years if we wanted him. So he'll be back next year. Mm.
Thank you again,
Mm.
David. Namaste.
Yeah, thanks to you,
Namaste.
Jerome and Katie and Rosemary, for supporting this process. Much
Thank
appreciated.
you. And thank you for coming, everyone.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.